welcome to another edition of Here We Are. I'm your host, Tia Mugabe, and today we're going to talk about South Africa. But before we get to our guests, here's a special report from Mr. L.S. Mugabe.
On March 18, 1992, many headlines around the world read, "The book is closed on apartheid in South Africa." But the referendum in South Africa did not close the book on apartheid, because Nelson Mandela and other Africans in that country still cannot vote. The threat of an all-out civil war is still a possibility in South Africa. The AWB, which is throughout the government, is yet to accept the changes that are going on. And there are the conservatives who have won some elections in recent months that still believe in apartheid today, tomorrow, and forever. The signs of those that still believe in apartheid still shines bright in South Africa. The conservatives say that the clerk has no mandate, while others say South Africa belonged to whites. The referendum that was passed on March 17, 1992, has not made things easier for CODESA, the Council for Democratic South Africa. The ANC and Inkatha are still fighting each other with help from the security forces and other white groups in South Africa. The government hands is still dripping with blood. This is L.S. Mugabe for Here We Are.
On March 17, 1992 in South Africa, the majority of whites there who voted did so in support of President de Klerk's continuing negotiation with CODESA. My guests today are, first, Mr. Melvin Johnson, who is the president of TransAfrica Chicago chapter. My next guest is Mr. Eric Broekhuysen, who is the South African consulate for the South African Consulate General in Chicago. Thank you both for coming to our program. It's so nice to have you.
It's good to be here.
In order for us to get a better understanding for what you do, I would like to ask you to give us some intels as to what your positions are. I mean, you know, what do you do in your positions? So, now don't everybody crowd. Do we have to do the eeny, meeny, miny, moe?
Well,
okay.
What I do as president of TransAfrica Chicago chapter is mainly to support TransAfrica's national office from Washington with the idea of educating the Chicago community on legislation affecting Africa and Caribbean nations. Mm-hmm. That's the role of my work here in Chicago.
How long has your organization been?
The TransAfrica National Organization was formed in 1974. Mm-hmm. The Chicago chapter was formed in 1981.
Oh, okay. Okay, and you, Mr. Broekhuysen? I hope I'm pronouncing it Broekhuysen.
Broekhuysen.
Broekhuysen,
yeah.
Okay.
I'm supposed to be the spokesman of the South African government in the Midwest. Our consular office has jurisdiction over 14 states, ranging from Ohio in the east to North Dakota in the north, and down to Oklahoma and Arkansas in the south. It's a fairly extensive area, and I deal with the political situation. I liaise with business leaders. We appear on occasions like this, talking to the public and informing them about the situation in South Africa. And that's basically in broad what I do.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the situation in South Africa. Like I said, either one of you can start on it, but I want to know pretty much your position, you know, the position that your organizations take as far as the situations in there. And I guess you really couldn't do that without explaining what's going on, so I'll leave that for you two to discuss.
Okay, well, I mean, basically the situation in South Africa now is that since the 2nd of February 1990, government has been involved in trying to level the political playing fields into allowing some kind of free political activity to take place in South Africa. With a view to that, President de Klerk unbanned the ANC and other black organizations. He released Nelson Mandela and all the other political prisoners, lifted the national state of emergency that was in operation throughout the country, has basically legislated away all the apartheid laws with one exception, and has entered into negotiations with the black majority regarding a new political constitution. Now, during 1990 and 91, the African National Congress identified what it called obstacles to any formal negotiation with government about the nitty-gritty of a new constitution. And they felt that these obstacles had to be removed before the ANC and other parties could sit down with government and negotiate properly about a new constitution. With the signing of the peace accord in September 1991, the African National Congress announced that as far as it was concerned, all the obstacles that had existed towards formal negotiations had now fallen away, and they then signaled their willingness to enter into negotiations with the government. As a result of that, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, or CODESA, met in Johannesburg on the 20th and the 21st of December 1991. And at that meeting, there were 19 political organizations representing probably 85% of the political spectrum in South Africa. The only representatives not present at that meeting were from the Pan-African Congress and AZAPO on the extreme left, and from the Conservative Party and the Afrikaner Resistance Movement on the extreme right. 17 of those 19 political organizations signed a declaration of intent at the end of the convention, the first meeting of the convention, committing themselves to doing all in their power to bring about a democratic South Africa. Since then, there has not been another formal meeting of the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. The next meeting is scheduled to take place at this stage around the 16th, 17th of May. But in the meantime, 4 important working committees have been established to look at some of the problems that the Convention for a Democratic South Africa has to make recommendations about. These 4 working committees are, the first one is dealing with the creation of a free political climate in South Africa. Obviously, with the unacceptably high level of violence that exists in South Africa, the intimidation which occurs on a wide spectrum right across the country, and the basic intolerance that exists between a lot of South Africans, whites and blacks. This is obviously a very important issue. The second working committee is dealing with constitutional principles and models. The third working committee is dealing with transitional arrangements, interim government arrangements, what has to be instituted to get South Africa from where it is at the moment to a truly democratic society. And the fourth working committee is looking at the possible reincorporation into South Africa of what we call the nominally independent homelands of Transkei, Botswana, Ciskei and Venda. Now that's what's happening at the moment. And as I said, the next meeting of the convention is scheduled to take place in May, the middle of May at this stage. It's conceivable that it might be postponed. It has been postponed already. It was originally due to meet at the end of March. But the indications are that it will take place at the end of May, or towards the middle of May.
And Mr. Johnson, you wanted to state your position.
Well, we think the Consul does what he does best, which is to tell the international community very, very misleading things about what is happening in South Africa. We like to tell what is happening, to what is not happening in South Africa, mainly from the point of view of the people who are victims of apartheid, and that basically means that he alluded to the obstacles facing the process of change and the interim government. And
what do you see as the obstacles?
The number one issue that's obstacle we see there is the South African government-sponsored violence that is the number one concern. You can't talk to people when they're fashioning ways to have you killed, and that's the number one obstacle to the talks about talks, which is basically what's going on. Much of the information getting out to the international community about substantial change and progress is just not true. As a matter of fact, on April 13th, in a telephone interview with Mr. Mandela here in Chicago, along with the cities of Detroit, Seattle, Phoenix, Arizona, and Washington, D.C., Mr. Mandela made it very clear that the continuing violence in South Africa is the number one obstacle to negotiations through the CODESA organization proceeding. As a matter of fact, he used that time to call for an interim peacekeeping force to come in and begin to deal with the violence problem, because the South African government is now saying that because the violence is continuing to go forth with, even since the referendum, some 300 people have been killed, and Mr. de Klerk is using the excuse of violence as a reason not to further the talks about the interim government. So we see things radically unchanged, and the violence being the #1 obstacle for that.
So what you're saying is that he's possibly using the violence there as a tactic to keep from hitting upon the issue of the referendum, or moving forward to
what we're saying is that the South African government uses every measure it can to continue its long history of stalling and buying time for any, as it reluctantly promotes any kind of irreversible changes in terms of black people having the right to vote and determine the laws in the country. The consul alluded to some steps that Mr. de Klerk took last year in terms of removing some things that were the focus of the U.S. anti-apartheid laws, like unbanning the ANC and freeing Mr. Mandela and all of those things. Well, in all the steps he took, he basically complied with the weakest parts of the U.S. law, and of course got Mr. Bush to lift the sanctions, which were, we think, having a great financial hardship on the South Africa's white population. And Mr. de Klerk used the weakest points of the law and spent about $2 million, and in essence got measures removed that were costing his country about $2 billion a year. So, but what is not said is that even in removing and unbanning the ANC and releasing Mr. Mandela, what he did not say was some 60 to 75 local laws that really formed the basis of the apartheid government, and most of those were unchanged and are still in place. As a matter of fact, many of them locally were strengthened, and all of the local municipalities in South Africa have the full measure of those laws still at their disposal. And that was one crucial part of the U.S. law, which said, even in Mr. Bush lifting the sanctions, the South African government should not have any measure at its disposal which could achieve the same thing as the 4 points of the law, which Mr. de Klerk very skillfully convinced the international community that he had removed.
Well, I want to take it this time that you want to comment on any of the statements that he made, that Mr. Johnson has made.
No, quite frankly, I think that if we had to respond to what each other said, we could spend the whole hour here talking about our differences. I frankly don't think that there's any point in doing that.
Well, you see,
there's a lot of stuff that Mr. Johnson and I ideologically would not agree on. The fact of the matter is that, and this is what people in America do not realize, the fact of the matter is that South Africa has been transformed from an apartheid society to a society which is very seriously looking at a new constitutional dispensation for all its citizens in a space of less than 2 years. And that is a considerable change in the status quo. Now, if TransAfrica and Mr. Johnson and other people like him want to maintain that nothing has changed, that is their privilege to do so. But if you have a look at what the South African government has done since the 2nd of February 1990, I think that you will be convinced that there is a very large amount of good faith involved in the negotiation process.
Well,
and I want to rest with that. I would prefer to talk about how we see a future South Africa rather than arguing about the past.
Well, you see, the past is not what we argue about. We argue about the very present, which is still the same. You see, the fundamental, the easiest way to look at whether there's been change, the most famous South African black person we know is Mr. Mandela, and he still can't vote and determine any laws that govern his behavior. So until he can do that, it doesn't matter whether it was March of '90 or September of last year. The measure we look at is what the victims of apartheid are still demanding. And at this present time, they are demanding the right to vote and be included in the laws. And the so-called changes expressed by Mr. de Klerk, they've always been slanted to give the white minority some kind of veto power in everything he's laid on the table. He keeps stressing. As a matter of fact, as soon as the referendum was held, he went on to the popular ABC show Nightline and spent about an hour and a half there, simply saying, if you listen very carefully, that in no way was there going to be any kind of government fashion where the white minority in the country would not have the veto power over any measures that might come out of this so-called interim government that's being talked about. So until those kind of things are written out of the law, TransAfrica and other anti-apartheid people throughout the international community do not see any change. So whether the Council wants to choose to talk about a future South Africa, we simply say that we hear frequently from victims of apartheid about the South African-sponsored delaying, and the violence is the #1 reason as to what is the best gauge of what's going on. So you can't talk about a future when the very person sitting here talking in terms of some of the activist people we meet, by the time when they get home, they tell us that members of their family have been kidnapped and they've not heard from them for several months, and they fear that they're being dead, so that they are dead. We've seen reports of leaders, leading activists from South Africa being killed since July of last year. So there hasn't been any change. As a matter of fact, the policy that the South African government has embarked upon, even during the talks that the CODESA negotiations, has been that of targeting activists for assassination. So where is there any real change? This is the point that we wish to express here.
I have no issue with Mr. Johnson at all about the fact that Nelson Mandela still does not have a vote in South Africa. That is perfectly obvious to everybody. But that's not the issue.
Well, the issue is violence, you see.
The issue is that the whole process of negotiation is in fact there to provide Mr. Mandela with a vote. And all the parties are entering into this negotiation process in good faith. So that, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that the negotiating process is going on, that there are inputs from all the parties around the table, that there is a great deal of wrangling and trying to get their point of view across in tough negotiations around the table, is all an indication to me that the process is continuing. I would not like to suggest at this stage that the type of scenario that is being suggested by Mr. Johnson is in fact going to take place.
Well, it's already taking place. It's not a scenario. We have very clear evidence of people dying every day. This is not a scenario which TransAfrica alleges to have happened. We simply get the reports from the death tolls that we see that are happening each day. And I think the March 17th referenda is a very good recent record, just to look at the number of people that have been killed since that time. So for you to sit here and say that we're talking about a scenario, we're talking about black South Africans still being killed. And we have information that the South African government is largely responsible either by its police force looking the other way while it's happening, or in many cases we know that they have been found to have recently some South African police people were found to be guilty of having killed some people at a funeral and that kind of thing. So we're not talking about a scenario. We're talking about real real deathly events that are taking place. And with the recent information of the South African government funding the Inkatha freedom fighters, the Inkatha party, how do you sit here and say that these are scenarios when the international community knows that people are dying from the efforts of the South African government? This is not a scenario.
Can I say straight out that the level of political violence in South Africa is unacceptably high? Everybody accepts that. It's certainly the concern of government that things at times tend to get out of hand. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the last thing that we need to promote a peaceful process of negotiation for a new constitution in South Africa.
What is the government doing
The fact is that the violence is continuing. And I think all parties that are subject or signatories to the National Peace Accord, which was signed in September '91, have to accept their responsibilities in this regard. The security forces are required in terms of the National Peace Accord to act and operate in certain fashions and measures which are based on international norms. In the same way, the political parties are required in terms of that same operation to stop their party political strife. The fact of the matter is that unfortunately, and I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but everybody is at fault here. The major political leaders that are at fault in South Africa for not getting their supporters on the ground to follow what they've been saying in public. Nelson Mandela comes out and says the violence is unacceptable and it should stop, but it doesn't stop. Gotcha Buthelezi says exactly the same thing, and what happens? Inkatha goes on with its level of violence.
I think
at the same time, there are rogue elements within the security forces who are fanning this unrest for their own agenda, but it is certainly not the policy of the government to support these elements, and in fact the evidence is quite to the contrary. The latest incident that you referred to, where a policeman was convicted for the murder of 8 people at Trust Feed outside Pietermaritzburg in 1988, is just the latest example of the fact that the government is taking action.
That is not true. That is not true.
Where people come forward. Could I just finish what I'm saying, please?
Well, to let you finish, might be to give you the advantage of misleading people again. The government did not initiate the investigation that led to the conviction of these people. It was 2 people who took it upon themselves to run the risk of facing the brunt of the South African government who brought the information out. So you're sitting here leaving the impression, or giving the impression, that this is another step to show that the South African government is taking steps to end the violence. What you did not ask, what the host asked you a question about, what was the government doing? Don't try to use this incident as a measure of saying this is something the government is doing. What we know the government is doing is funding groups like the Inkatha people who, to this very day, wreak violence and kill people in the township of Alexandra. We heard from the people last week concerning recent killings that have taken place there, and some of the single-sex hostels where people have to go and live away from their families while they work in the mines and things like this. So this is what the government is doing, is looking the other way while it funnels money to this group. And we don't see that as any kind of efforts on the part of the government to really end the violence problem, which is the #1 obstacle to negotiations taking place in that country.
If I may now continue. What has basically happened is that government has, since the 2nd of February 1990, agreed with the rest of the majority of South Africa that we need a negotiated settlement in South Africa. There's no question about government's firmness on this, and there's no question about its bona fides either, in spite of the aspersions that Mr. Johnson is casting in that direction. We have had, unfortunately, since 1984, we've had a tradition of violence which has been established. And I don't want to point fingers, but I just want to point out that the situation is not as easy as Mr. Johnson seems to indicate. In 1984, the African National Congress, in exile, called on blacks in South Africa to make the townships ungovernable. And that opened the sluice gates to a level of violence and in the townships directed against black councillors who had opted to operate within the system. 5 years of that process going on. And at the same time, the African National Congress was trying to establish itself in areas where previously it had very little support. This happened in parts of Natal. The ANC decided to move into areas around Pietermaritzburg in 1987, and this led to friction with the Zulus. Now, the African National Congress is traditionally a Xhosa-based party. Although they have a wide membership, they are, and still are today, to a large extent, a Xhosa-based party, whereas Inkatha is a Zulu-based party. And there are ethnic differences between these two groups, and
Sure, go right ahead.
They have a large tradition of violence among these groups. And when the African National Congress tried to move into Pietermaritzburg and establish themselves, Inkatha fought back. And then Inkatha decided to get themselves reef townships after 1989. And that's where the violence in the Transvaal has come from, to a large extent. There are a lot of other aspects which are also factors which operate on the level of violence. But to a large extent, the violence that we've seen in South Africa over the last 7 or 8 years has been politically motivated violence. Now, that is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to government. I accept the statement by leaders of the various black political organizations that it's unacceptable to their organizations as well. The problem is that the people on the ground seem to be out of control of the people who lead the various groupings in South Africa. And this is our big tragedy, that we cannot seem to get control over the people who are actually involved in the day-to-day violence. I just want to point out, just a few days ago, 2 African National Congress members were arrested in police clothing, driving a car which looked like a police vehicle from the scene of an incident of violence. Now, I'm not saying that this is commonplace. I'm just mentioning it to point out that there are a lot of factors which the public is generally not aware of, which doesn't always come out, and which indicates that the violence is much more widespread in origin than purely stemming from government sources. I accept completely that government has a commitment to maintain law and order and maintain security and stop the violence. But there is a very large onus that rests on the leaders of the various groupings in South Africa to do their bit and to bring it under control. Because with the continued violence, South Africa as a country has no future.
Well, let me say this, and then I'll let you get your what you have to say and to respond to what he is saying. Now, my point is that when you say that a lot of people don't know, a lot of proposals from the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, has been brought to President de Klerk as far as bringing peaceful forces in, and they all have failed up to this point at the time of the interview. I mean, can you speak to that? Why would he not want other peaceful forces? Well, not to say he wouldn't want, but why have the other attempts to have peaceful forces come in fail?
Well, the thing is that I think to a large extent this hinges on the sovereignty of a country. We are not a colonial situation. We're a sovereign independent nation. The fact is, up to now, we haven't had 80% participation in the government, but we are a recognized international country. And for the South African government, any government for that matter, to then allow international forces in to monitor violence, etc., infringes on its political sovereignty. So I think that any government would be loath to allow the United Nations or the Organization of African Unity in to do so.
Okay.
Particularly when there is a perception on the part of government that a lot more can be done by the various leaders in South Africa to try and bring this violence to a halt. Now, I can mention it because I think that it's valid. In the past, the South African police used very heavy-handed methods to suppress the violence. And at that stage, of course, they were accused of being oppressors. Now the situation has changed, and to a certain extent, I think, the security forces are under pressure from internal sources mainly to handle these situations with a measure of kid gloves. Understandably so, because government doesn't want to aggravate a situation which is already sensitive and explosive, and which could explode with tremendous violence at the drop of a hat. So I think that there must be general recognition that there is a problem. But I still think that the onus rests on the political leadership of the country to bring their followers to heel and to make them respect the fact that violence is an unnecessary adjunct which shouldn't be permitted. My own personal feeling is that the closer we get to a political settlement...
The Consul will have a way of talking throughout the show and simply taking the time to express, again, his very skilled ability to use the time to send misleading excuses, to say that the South African government, with all of its resources, cannot do more to stop the violence and to try to shift the burden onto the various political leaders. Interesting, if you view Buthelezi as a political leader, nothing has been said in terms of the Consul of what it plans to do to shift, to stop aiding that leader with the ability to rage the violence. Clearly not said here. And so if government wants to do anything, it might want to start with not trying to create another so-called, bring another party to the playing field of which he alluded to earlier, saying that the government is trying to make sure that the playing field is level. Well, we view the Inkatha party as a surrogate for the South African government at the negotiating table. That's one problem with that point of view. By saying that we want to blame the political leaders who can't control people when you're at the very center of the problem, and not saying the South African government is taking these steps is just not good enough. It's unacceptable. And all of the people whom we speak to, who are not people at Mr. Mandela's level in the society, simply can tell you of the daily incursions of the police forces. They're not operating with kid gloves. What's happening is it's not being reported on what they're doing. So why he would sit here and give the misleading, again, information that they're operating with kid gloves is not true. Black South Africans fear every day the arm of the South African government through its police forces coming to do at will what they want to, because mainly they have no measure in terms of law that black South Africans have crafted or can participate in to make their actions to provide some legal remedy for it. So until blacks have the right to vote, there's no reason to think that this is going to change.
I would like to come back on the fact that I'm being accused of providing incorrect information. Mr. Johnson has just indicated that it's not reported on. I frankly find that difficult to believe, because before February 1990, the press were not allowed into the unrest areas. They were not allowed to report on the violence. They were subject to police censorship. Since then, that censorship has been removed, and media crews in South Africa are free to move wherever they like. The fact of the matter is, the press has found out that a lot of the stuff that they accused the South African government of prior to February 1990 was in fact caused by black factions in the townships. So that this is why it is no longer newsworthy.
Well, see, the reason...
The fact is, it is not reported because it isn't news anymore.
Well,
it has become an everyday occurrence in South Africa, which I personally find absolutely unacceptable, and the government also is on record as saying that the level of violence is totally unacceptable. We cannot live with that kind of violence. We cannot carve ourselves a future.
Well, what we're saying is being on record saying what you can't live with, and on one side, and on the other side, you're actually making it happen. We find that inconsistent and hypocritical and unacceptable. That's the point we want to make here. So as long as the government is not really using its resources to stop the violence, so that things can really, negotiations can seriously take place, rather than to use the violence as a means to delay effective negotiation. That's the point we want to make here. And the Consul has not indicated in anything he's said that that's the position that the government is taking.
Could you speak to a timetable that, I mean, I understand you saying that a lot of negotiations have been delayed because of different things that are happening, but has there been any type of timetable that's been introduced to expedite this? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, there is. There is a very specific time frame that's involved in this whole question. The last general election for whites only was held in South Africa in 1989. The next general election, in terms of the present existing constitution, which is racially based, is due at the end of 1994. So that, and I should add, President de Klerk is on record as saying that he is not going to have another white election. So basically, a new constitution for South Africa has to be in place and operating by the end of 1994. So that's the broad time frame. What we see happening now in the working committees of CODISA is that there appears to be a very large amount of convergence within the working groups, particularly on constitutional models and proposals, as well as the interim government or transitional government arrangements. And I suspect that at the next meeting of CODISA on the 16th and 17th of May, that there will be general agreement on certainly the outlines of a new constitution, and very probably the outlines of an interim government to get us from here to there. Now, that being the case, if that scenario that I'm now trying to paint comes to pass, and I have every reason to believe that it will, we will then have the situation where in June or July this year, Nelson Mandela would be included in an interim government council, And he will in all probability stand up and say to the world, we're happy with the situation, we're part of a transitional government arrangement, we have executive authority, even although he doesn't have the vote at that stage. He has executive authority in carrying out policy. Now that is, and then that transitional arrangement, whichever is agreed in CODESA, is then going to be responsible for a one-man, one-vote election in South Africa.
Again,
to
the Consul
elect,
wants to
could
use
I please finish, if you don't mind?
Finishing means the hour will be over.
Can I just finish, please? That transitional government is going to be responsible for arranging, and I want to repeat it, a one-man, one-vote election in South Africa to elect a constituent assembly to write a new constitution in terms of the general principles that have been accepted by CODESA. Now that is going to happen early in 1993. So that's the time frame within which we're working. And I don't think that very many Americans realize quite how far we've gone along on the process and how close we are to a final agreement. That is not to say that there is not going to be very tough negotiations in the working committees and at CODESA. Obviously, people are going to be tough in their negotiations. They're going to take a stand and they're going to try and get the best possible deal they can. But the point is that the leaders of South Africa are committed to getting a new constitution in place before the end of 1994 on a negotiated basis. And that is going to be the basis on which we have, as a country, a future.
Thank you. And your comment, Mr. Johnson?
I think to say that what President de Klerk is on record for having said may again not put all the facts on the table. The very idea of a referendum in the first place, which Mr. de Klerk is now saying certain things are going to happen by when, you leave out the fact that it is Mr. de Klerk saying when things are going to happen, and not the victims of apartheid, not Mr. Mandela. And I don't think we should sit here and while you did ask the consul for a particular timetable, I wouldn't want to think that he should be able to use Mr. Mandela to say what he will probably say. I think Mr. Mandela is the person who should speak for what he thinks and when he thinks timetables ought to be, rather than the government of South Africa saying what he thinks Mr. Mandela would probably say. I think we should always wait to hear what Mr. Mandela says, rather than to try to lead the international community into, or the citizens of Chicago into what Mr. Mandela will do. Because oftentimes things get misquoted and missaid, and it is not Mr. Mandela saying anything about any time of 1994 or any particular time frame. It is the South African government who is saying that. And he mentions constitutionally, again, a constitution that left out 80% of its citizens in its formation. So until a constitution is in place that says all of South Africa's citizens of all races have input in determining what it is, and I think we should wait for the victims who can't have anything to say about that to speak about what kind of timetable they are saying. We want these things to happen on the timetable, very much different than the South African government, because we see the South African government keeps changing there's no guarantee, as a matter of fact, no irreversible guarantees that 1994 will mean anything either, because the same people that set that up are still in control. So why should we be led to think that because Mr. de Klerk says anything that is going to be? There's no redress by victims of apartheid to make anything he says happen or not happen.
I think an interesting question to be brought up now would be why the reasons behind why majority white South Africans feel that it's time to step up the process of abolishing apartheid.
Well, I think that it's a combination of factors.
And also, and you both can comment on this.
I think we've realized that, and I'm talking now as a white South African, not necessarily a spokesman of the government. I think that white South Africans...
He can't speak. He's here as the spokesman of the government.
Okay.
I'm putting my point of view as a white South African on this particular issue. I think that the whites in South Africa have realized that the only way to a future for themselves and all other South Africans in South Africa is to have a peaceful negotiation process in terms of which the Constitution, which will be supported by a majority of the population, comes into force. We have seen over the last 45 years, since the policy of apartheid was introduced in 1948, that that policy was bankrupt and that it is leading nowhere except to greater internal turbulence, it's leading to greater socio-economic stress, and it's leading to greater international isolation.
Would you agree with that,
And
Mr.
I think that most white South Africans realize that if we had continued on this road, that was the type of future that was facing us. And I think that that price is simply too hard to bear. So that I think that most whites in South Africa have realized that the only future that we have in South Africa, and you must remember, we have no other place to go. We are Africans in that sense, is that we have to come to an accommodation which is acceptable to the rest of the inhabitants of the country. And I think that the signal that was sent out by the referendum is a very strong signal from the white community. It's saying to the black community, we, the white community, are 100% in favor of extending the same rights and privileges that we as whites enjoy in this country to all our black brothers and sisters. And I think that that's a very strong signal also internationally.
Okay. And what do you say to that, Mr. Johnson?
We say that the signal sent by the referendum, 69% of the white South Africans, in terms of those who voted, we think it was more of a measure to avoid the international isolation that they faced, and thus would bring some very uncomfortable times for white South Africans. So to that extent, that's how we view perhaps a suggestion to Mr. de Klerk to continue some efforts. But that alone is probably not enough by simply, we don't see white South Africans really, they have the freedom to express at any time. They don't have to wait for a referendum to say that apartheid should end. And the Consul can say he's speaking as a white South African. It is not our understanding that large numbers of white South Africans on a daily basis speak to the issue of ending the apartheid system. So we think that there are some entrenched opulence that they enjoy living, and in any way that they can continue to have that, we don't think that they're going to give that up easy. So when large numbers of South African people step forward and say, not by a referendum which allows the government to stall, but by simply taking real efforts to restore on their own black South Africans to areas where they were historically removed from, and taking measures to make sure that the South African government begins to fund education facilities for black students. We know right now, under some of the stuff laid up on the table by the de Klerk government in this referendum era, was something like we call school reform, where under one scenario the government says it will close a white school before blacks could be admitted. Scenario B would say 90% of white folks have to admit that a black student can come to this school in order for the school for blacks to attend. Well, we don't see 90% of white folks saying black students can come to schools. Under scenario C, the white government says, yes, we're going to close the school first, and then we're going to run it. So, and again, we think that white South Africans make up the government, and we don't see white South Africans ending or speaking heavily, strongly against those kind of so-called education reform measures. We don't think there's no word for reform with respect to apartheid. Apartheid cannot be reformed. It has to be ended. Another thing, with respect to education in the country, white farmers basically control the education that black people receive. We don't, again, see white farmers saying, I'm willing to hire and teachers they run schools only to make sure that people have the ability to do on the farms what they want. We don't find white farmers going to the South African government saying this is wrong and it should end. So until we see measures like that, we don't want to think that white South Africans are really on record of wanting this to end. There's no evidence.
Can I come in on that?
Yes, you may.
It just shows how much Mr. Johnson is out of touch with what's happening in South Africa. As far as the school system is concerned, he mentioned he doesn't see whites or 90% of whites accepting that black students should be allowed into school. The interesting fact is, and this is a fact, that in some 85% of the schools that have been allocated to this so-called Plan B system, where the white parents have to decide whether black should be admitted or not, the white parent body have voted overwhelmingly in favor of admitting blacks to previously all white schools. So obviously what he is saying is not true. I want to make it perfectly clear that we're talking about two different things here. The whole question of apartheid is always thrown as the big problem. And I want to state it categorically, that apartheid was a policy applied by government over a period of 42 years in which racial segregation was the rule. That policy has been abolished. It no longer exists.
That is not true. The laws that make it work are still there.
The policy
have the laws been changed? Have they been removed from the legal books of the South African legal structure? Have those laws been removed?
Every single law, with the exception of one law, has been removed from the statute book. That is why I can say quite categorically that the policy of apartheid has been abolished by the South African government.
I think quite categorically you're misleading people.
I know
you represent the government, but we have people who live in South Africa who speak to us on a regular basis, and the laws of which we speak of are still there. For you to say,
Mr. Johnson, can I make my point?
Yes, your point
without
is
interruption.
Well, if you want to attempt to mislead this audience, I don't feel it's my duty to interrupt when I think that you're giving facts that we feel are untrue.
I am not. You feel that, but it is not true. The policy of apartheid.
Well, when I say I think we say the victims of apartheid tell us that what you're saying is not true, and I want to make that very clear. We're not. Our research shows one thing, but yet we get frequent faxes, phone calls, or whichever, from people who live throughout South Africa, and they say that the legal undergirdings of apartheid are still in place. Now, you're here to tell this audience that those are not the facts, when simply there's been no, again, I don't think that they are deliberately telling us, because they face...
I have a certain credibility, and I don't like my credibility being called into question. You can question my motives, and you can question my way of thinking and so on, but to call me a liar on TV is not the way to do it. I'm telling you now that the policy of apartheid has been abolished by the South African government. All the laws, with the exception of one law, has been abolished, scrapped from the statute book in South Africa. The one law that remains is the present constitution, which is racially based, and which is going to be replaced by a negotiated constitution. Now that is a fact. That is a situation. What I think Mr. Johnson refers to, and a lot of other people also refer to, when they talk about apartheid, is in fact simply discrimination. And I am not going to deny that discrimination in South Africa doesn't exist and is not going to continue into the future.
But
of course it is.
The discrimination is determined by local laws, which make it happen. How can you say...
Let me repeat.
At this time, I'm going to allow him to finish our conversation. I mean, our comments, can't be too long because we're getting to the close to the end of the show. But with a limited time,
I want to make it clear that the policy of government, in terms of which it governed on a racial basis, has been abolished. A lot of discrimination in South Africa exists and will continue to exist. And it's going to be the problem of any future government which is elected in terms of a democratic constitution to have to deal with that situation. Any government, a black government, a mixed government, a white government, is going to have to deal with that fact. And the question is, how are we going to go about to bring about redress to the have-nots? How are we going to act in such a way that economic imbalances which have been built into the system over the last 40 years can be removed? That is the challenge that faces any government in South Africa. And I think it's important that this distinction be made between apartheid, which is a government policy practiced on the basis of law, and discrimination, which is a condition which exists, should be made and should be accepted and should be made firmly. There's no question that discrimination in South Africa is going to continue for a very long time. Black people, unfortunately, are going to suffer. But the point is, in terms of a new constitution, which will include a Bill of Rights, everybody will have equal access to the law, and everybody will have equal access to redress whatever has been done to them in terms of past policy. And that, I think, is a very positive attitude. It's a very positive expression, and it's a great hope for the future of South Africa.
Okay, now your comment?
My comment is that we don't see any real difference between discrimination and apartheid. They equal the same thing, in that the basis for apartheid brings discrimination. It brings exclusion. It brings misfunding, unequal funding of education, unequal funding of health care, unequal funding of housing. Those conditions continue to exist in the South African society today. Black people cannot vote to do anything about changing those conditions. And a new constitution, or talks about a new constitution, where black people have a right to make laws that will determine which way the resources in the country are directed, is what we think and we hear victims of apartheid want to hear and want to see. And we don't see any, as a matter of fact, we often see efforts of the government supporting private the private ownership of major resources. So again, any kind of change you find a new government saddled with, in many cases, not control of many resources. So that's also a policy that's the South African government has been embarking upon in recent years, even since the March 90 release of Mr. Mandela. So to sit here and say that apartheid is over as a philosophy, but not to mention the other kinds of legal maneuvers that the government has been involved in, which in essence bring exclusion and discrimination. Apartheid means exclusion, it means discrimination, and until they're one and the same in the eyes of people who face it every day.
So what Mr. Johnson is in fact saying is that there is a policy of apartheid applicable in America. And I think that you would find that most government authorities in this country would dispute that statement.
I would say...
The fact of the matter is we have a tremendous amount of discrimination in South Africa. There's no doubt about that. I'm not even going to argue. I'm not here to defend apartheid. I'm not a spokesman for apartheid. In fact, I'm very happy that things are moving in the direction that they are moving in South Africa. But there is a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. On the socio-economic level, education is one of our major problems. Social welfare is a major problem. Our health situation in South Africa, while good in African terms, is certainly not up to what we would want it to be. And all these problems are going to have to be faced by whatever government is voted into power in terms of a new constitution, probably as early as 1993. And we are going to have to deal with those.
I don't know. I would probably, rather than to respond to whether or not apartheid is in the United States, I think U.S. citizens can best judge whether or not there are legal laws in its legal system that have a legal basis for separation or based on color. I do know that at one time that there certainly were policies and law of this land that had the same effect in terms of whether or not there's discrimination. Discrimination in the United States and discrimination in South Africa in terms of black people, it's the same as poverty. Poverty in the United States is nowhere near the poverty of people living in the backyards of their neighbors in shacks called homes, and people rent their backyards for shacks under the apartheid system. That is in place in the township of Alexandra this afternoon. So to say that, and when the people ask the government for funds for building homes, the clerk-led government today is doing nothing about increasing the housing stock in the township of Alexandra, which has a bucket system for its bathroom facilities. To sit here and say that these things are not the rule and are not the practice and are not the everyday law, everyday condition that black South Africans face is just untrue. And until those kinds of everyday conditions of life have changed for black people, we're not concerned about what the South African government is saying. We're concerned about what the victims who go through these things every day face and see. And we think when they say it's changed, that we certainly would give the credit to whomever is leading the government at that time to make it happen.
Okay, very quickly, we don't have that much time left. I want you to give your comment, but I want you to both give me your stand as to what we need to do now to move forward. What is it that, either is being done or what needs to be done to move forward? And I'll start with
you. Go ahead.
You.
I think from Chicago, what needs to happen is the Chicago community should be in touch with anti-apartheid organizations, TransAfrica being one. They are the Committee on Solidarity with Southern Africa, the Chicago Alexander Sister Community. Each of these organizations have direct input from South Africa as to what needs to be done. The Chicago can urge members of the City Council and members of Springfield to maintain the local sanctions that continue to deny the South African government money to make the apartheid system work. That's the thing we think should be done.
Okay, thank you very much. And you, Mr. Broekhuysen?
Okay, South Africa is moving very definitely in the direction of a democratic future. There's no doubt in my mind that within the next 2 years we will have a democratic constitution in place. One man, one vote will be the order of the day. We will have a constitution, I would imagine, very similar to the US Constitution, including a Bill of Rights. And in terms of that, all South Africans will have equal access to the law and equal access to opportunity. The fact that there are great disparities existing in South Africa is a fact. It's a given situation. And I think that what needs to be done now is that the South African economy needs to be put into the shape where it can expand and where it can provide jobs for the more than 40% unemployed that exists among the black population, so that we can at least, any government that's elected in terms of this new constitution can at least satisfy some of the aspirations of the people who put them in power. Otherwise, any government, irrespective of its color, is going to face a revolution in South Africa. Okay.
I would like to thank both of you. We have certainly just scratched the surface of this subject that would run more than definitely an hour long. I want to thank both of you for coming to the program. Please feel free to come back again. At this time, we're going to go to an editorial. Now, the views and opinions expressed in this editorial are those of the commentator and not necessarily of Here We Are, Utah Communications, or its sponsors.
This summer, Chicago could be ripe and ready for similar outbursts as was witnessed in Los Angeles and other United States cities. The outbursts will not come as a decision of the Rodney King verdict, but decisions that have allowed a climate to be created of 40% unemployment among black youth, decisions that have knocked 60,000 people off the general assistance rolls, decisions that allow the county to build more jails than schools, and decisions that allow more white people to work in black neighborhoods on construction sites than black men are able to get. These decisions are symbols that can spell trouble if they're not dealt with in the hot summer days ahead. While our community may be frustrated and angered by these actions, we must not let our anger and frustration become self-destructive. We must be able to put more heat on our politicians to do the right thing and not self-destruct by burning our cities. This has been a personal commentary by Billy Montgomery, reflecting my own views, not those of this station, producer, or the host.
It's now the time in our program when we recommend to you a book for the month. And the book that we recommend this month is called The Black Family in White America. And that book is written by Andrew Billingsley. Reading is good for you, and we encourage you to do that. On behalf of all of us here at Here We Are, I'm your host, Tia Mugabe, and until next time, as always,